Broken Bow, Nebraska. She had been waiting more than a week for the black ice to melt and the farm roads to clear, but Marlene Kennedy, 84, was unwilling to wait any longer. She changed into snow boots, tucked her heart medication into her purse, and stepped out to the porch. She held onto a railing with one hand and to her daughter with the other, inching down the frozen walkway toward her garage, trying not to think about her husband's slip and fall, which had shattered his hip and eventually forced him into a nursing home located more than an hour away. It had been 10 days since her last visit to see him, the longest they'd been apart in 63 years of marriage. He had Parkinson's disease, which made it impossible for him to talk on the phone. She'd called the nursing staff for daily updates, and they said her husband seemed quiet, and he was losing his appetite. "Why is it still so bad out here?" Marlene asked. Her feet skidded on the ice, and she wrapped her arm around her daughter's shoulder as they moved closer to the car. Maybe it would be easier in a few hours, once the sun warms up, said her daughter, Deb Kennedy, 51. "No. I'm at the end of my rope already," Marlene said. "Poor Earl's probably wondering if we left him alone down there." In the first months after her husband's fall, Marlene had helped Earl Kennedy move into a nursing home 3 minutes from their house in Broken Bow, a town of 3,000, close enough that she could visit him twice a day. But then that nursing home went bankrupt and closed in May, one of more than 260 rural nursing facilities across the country to shut down for financial reasons in the past 3 years, sending another family on a desperate search for the basic medical care that is disappearing from rural America. Marlene tried to get Earl into the only other nursing home in Broken Bow, but that facility had managed to stay solvent in part by limiting the number of residents on Medicaid, as Earl was, because the federal program pays nursing homes in Nebraska about $40 less per day than the cost of providing care. The nursing homes in Ainsworth and Minden had already closed, and the one located next to a grain elevator in Callaway was running a waiting list. The best option Marlene could find was a shared room in the town of Cozad, more than 50 miles away down remote 2-lane roads, and Marlene had been making the trip back and forth several times each week ever since. This time, Deb had offered to drive her, and they rode away from the single-story house where Marlene and Earl had raised 4 children, and then past the grocery store where he had stocked shelves for 47 years. They continued beyond the feedlots on the outskirts of town, dense with cattle covering the hillsides. The road narrowed through a maze of cornfields. Frozen snow crunched beneath the tires and wind beat against the windows as they drove for miles without seeing another car. "There's a dip coming up here," Marlene told her daughter, as the road climbed over a frozen creek. "Where?" "I don't see it." She and Earl had rarely traveled outside of Nebraska, and they'd never been on an airplane. Many of their trips together in recent years had been medical trips, the escalating cost of a life spent in rural America, which in the past decade has lost at least 250 maternity wards, 115 hospitals, 3,500 primary care doctors, 2,000 medical specialists and hundreds of nursing homes. Marlene and Earl had traveled together to Lincoln for a heart operation, Kearney for an ankle, Grand Island for a hip, Omaha for corneal transplants, and then finally to Cozad in the back of a nursing home transport van for what Marlene feared would be Earl's final trip. He was almost 88, and he could no longer walk or eat solid foods. Marlene had already paid for their adjacent cemetery plots in Broken Bow, where Earl had spent his entire adult life, but there was no place left in town where he could live safely until he died. Deb slowed to pass a tractor. Marlene waved to the driver and then stared out the window, where rolling hills went on for miles. The prairie was empty except for hay bales and a few pieces of farming equipment left out in the snow. "You all right?" Deb asked. "You seem quiet." "This drive always feels long," Marlene said. You spend your whole life tied up right next to somebody, and then you don't get to be there for the hardest parts. It doesn't seem natural. You didn't have a choice. Deb said. No, but that doesn't stop me from worrying about him. Marlene said, because that was what she'd been doing for much of the past week and a half as she waited for the weather to improve. She'd worried that Earl's bed was pressed too close to the window on subfreezing nights, and that the khakis she'd bought for him to wear weren't thick enough, and that he was losing too much weight to keep himself warm, and that if he wasn't warm he wouldn't be able to sleep. She'd worried about what he might be doing if he wasn't sleeping, since his eyesight made it difficult for him to read or watch TV or do much of anything except move back and forth from his bed to his wheelchair, in which case 10 days might have felt to him like forever. She'd worried he felt confused by her absence, or upset, or scared, or even abandoned. I'd be with him every day if I could. Marlene said. He knows that, right? Of course. He knows we all want to be there. Deb said. She drove by a large grain elevator and turned into the town of Kozad, parking in front of a small nursing home. She opened the passenger door and reached down to help her mother out of the car. I bet you'll feel better once you get a chance to visit with him, she said. I don't like being a visitor. Marlene said. I'm not a visitor to him. Marlene Kennedy greets her husband at the nursing home. Earl Kennedy, 88, has Parkinson's disease. Michael S. Williamson, The Washington Post. Marlene Kennedy greets her husband at the nursing home. Earl Kennedy, 88, has Parkinson's disease. Michael S. Williamson, The Washington Post. They walked down a tiled hallway with fluorescent lighting to a small room with an American flag taped beside the door. Marlene stepped into the front half of the room, which for the past 15 years had belonged to Earl's new roommate, Oscar. He waved from his wheelchair, and then Marlene pulled back a curtain to reveal the back half of the room, where Earl was in the same position as she'd last seen him, 10 days earlier. He sat in his wheelchair with his body bent over to the right, wearing a baseball cap on his head and a kerchief to protect his shirt. He faced a TV that wasn't on and a window with a view of snow-covered recycling bins. Marlene put her hand on his shoulder and leaned down to kiss his forehead. I missed you, Earl, she said. I missed you so bad I couldn't stand it. He smiled at her and nodded. He reached over to his bed and picked up a holiday card he'd received from one of their great-grandchildren. He'd shown it to Marlene on her last visit, and now he handed it to her again. Isn't that something, she said, rubbing his back, pulling over a chair until it was pressed right up against his. She set the card down and rested her head against his shoulder. I missed you, Earl, she said again. Did you miss me? Well, he said. His lips tried to form more words, but they wouldn't come. He'd been working with a speech therapist to fight back the advance of Parkinson's and maintain his ability to eat, swallow and speak, but lately Marlene thought he had fewer good days than bad. She leaned in and tried to read his lips, smiling at him, waiting for him to talk as she rubbed his shoulders. His mind was still sharp, and some days his sentences came more easily as time went along. She believed the kind and respectful thing to do was to stay patient and wait through the silence, until after a few moments of watching Earl struggle, she decided the kinder thing was to break it. I wanted to come just about every day, but this weather had other ideas, she told him. You missed me, though, Earl. Didn't you? Well, he said again. He smiled and reached over to wrap his arm around her shoulder. Yeah, I knew it, she said. You missed me. And what all did I miss here? Well, the usual, he said, beginning to find his voice. He pointed out toward the weekly schedule that was posted on the wall, a resident social hour at 8 a.m., 3 pureed meals in the cafeteria each day, bingo on Wednesdays and Fridays, Bible study on Tuesdays, Wheel of Fortune in the community room each night. 5 residents had died in the past few weeks, and each time the nursing staff had made up the bed with a red rose and a copy of the same poem on the pillow. I am home in heaven, dear ones, oh so happy and so bright. A.D. I suppose you didn't miss much. Earl said. Life in a rest home. We rest. Marlene laughed. You never were much of a complainer, she said. No, he said. I guess not.